get to do any fishing or hunting up in Alaska at all?
No, we didn't do any hunting or fishing.
No.
Not around where we was.
Oh, yeah.
It's all reserved,
Mm.
natural,
National park.
natural park.
Yeah. Well, you probably do. You can jump in there and grab something.
We had grids in them.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Had a moose come through. and a
Several
baby.
times. We had a moose and a baby. Had a moose between both properties.
Good. That was one thing we didn't see when we went to Yellowstone was a moose.
Moose.
I wish we would have. I got a picture of one from a guy that I sent a grizzly picture to.
There you go.
He sent me a
I'll
moose
trade you
picture.
one grizzly for one moose.
Yeah, so that worked out.
Don't think it's the same.
No, the grizzly is pretty neat to see. But, all right, we are in Esther chapter 2. If you remember where we got to a couple weeks ago, I appreciate Caleb covering for me last week. We got part of the way through chapter 2, if I remember right. I'm not exactly sure. 14? That's kind of what I thought. Okay, thank you. So we talked about what is going on in this chapter, and something to remember about this chapter is the fact that this is fact. This is information about what had happened during that time. This is nothing God approved of, but as we've talked about, does God use bad situations or people that are not doing good things for his purpose? Yes, he does. We've seen that many times throughout history. How many times did God use Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar and other nations that were wicked to destroy well, not destroy, but punish the Israelites for their wickedness several times? So,
Still does too, we just don't.
yeah. Yeah, I think God still definitely has control over what's going on. That's biblical. I mean, God put the people that are in power there for a reason. And maybe we just don't see why. But God can you take situations that are bad and use them for his purpose. And I think that's what's going on here. Nothing in this chapter is good that happens, except for the fact that Esther is going to be put into position, or she has, as we already talked about. She becomes queen. Well, we haven't got there yet, but she's going to become queen. She's going to be put into a situation that's going to help God's people and preserve the lineage of Christ. And so, somebody want to read verse 15 through the end of the chapter.
Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go in to the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai and the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other women, more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. When virgins gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king.
All right, so as we talked about, we ended up in verse 14. We see that And it's like verse 12 tells us that each woman's turn came to go to the king. And as we talked about, she would go to the king and come back the next morning. And then she would be put into basically the house of the concubines. And once she was there, she was a slave for the rest of her life. She was never going to marry anybody. She would never be able to leave. Slave as in she was a concubine. She would never even see the king again unless she was asked by name. And so this could have been the case for Esther also. But we see differently here. Of course, as we talked about, what happened to Daniel immediately as he became a slave, in a sense, to Nebuchadnezzar. Everything happened, he saw favor. He found favor in whosever's eyes he was in front of. Joseph was the same way. Even though he was put into prison, God gave him favor in the eyes of the people that was there. And same happened with Esther. So we see that example with those other two. Obviously, God has a hand in this, because she is found favor by those that she was around immediately. And so the same happens with her and Xerxes, or Ahasuerus. And so she goes in in her turn, and when she goes in, as we talked about before, each virgin was given the opportunity to bring something with her. So it could be an article of wear, something that was in the king's court or the king's house. She could take something, whatever the case may be. And each one of them, it tells us that they made the choice. But what did Esther do? The king, the head eunuch that was over them, she let him tell her what to take. Was that wise? I think so. I think we're seeing with Esther that she has some wisdom. She knew that she shouldn't make the choice. She should let the person that knows what he's doing make the choice. And obviously it helped. It worked. And so she found favor with Haggai, and then she finds favor with Ahasuerus. And so verse 16, she was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, so it tells us exactly when it happened. And it says in verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. And so it kind of appears, as the text states, that Xerxes kind of immediately knew she was the one to be the queen. He loved her immediately. He didn't have to search anymore. He made his choice. And you look at that word love there, it wasn't more than, it was more, I think, from what the word, if it looks at, it's more than just her appeal of her appearance. As we've seen, her heart, her character matched her appearance in a sense. And so she was beautiful on the inside and the outside, and that seems to correlate with Xerxes here also. And so then we see that what did he do? He found grace, and she found grace and favor in his sight. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen. So then verse 18, the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the province and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. So he celebrated her becoming queen with a great feast and a holiday, and gave her gifts. We don't know what the gifts were, but I'm sure, he's the king. He can give anything he wants.
Is there another page to chapter 2 besides 1 and 2?
Yes, and I didn't get it printed off.
Oh, okay.
It's just not much. It's just a little
Because
bit.
I have 2 chapter 2s, and I'm like,
Oh, yeah.
so I guess I have the same page.
I don't think I printed it off, so I'll have to get that printed off for you. We just got a little bit left. And so that ends the search for a queen. And so here he has Esther's now his queen. And so then that brings us to verse 19. It says, when the virgins were gathered together a second time. Now, what does that mean? it's interesting. I don't know. There's a lot of thoughts on what that means. It could have been that this was another gathering of virgins, and because he was trying to increase his harem or his concubines. It could be that. It could have been it was those that were from farther away that arrived. I don't know. But it's interesting that he's already picked a queen, and now he is, in a sense, doing this again. Not to search for a queen, but I think it more is filling his house, the concubines.
My commentary says that they weren't, the ones that weren't allowed to be present at her feast might have got together at a different time to celebrate with their friend.
Okay. So a celebration of her being queen. Okay, that's interesting. It could be. And so, yeah, it could have been the fact that it was those that of her friends and whatnot celebrating. But whatever the case may be, there was a gathering together. And in this gathering, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, has he always been here? Yeah. Or has he been since the day she was taken? Constantly wanting to know what's going on with her. And so here he is again. So verse 20 says, now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. So again, reinforcing her respect and her honor in Mordecai being her adopted father in a sense, even though he was her cousin, and respecting his wishes. Why? Because, if you think about it, when we get into chapter 3, Haman doesn't even bring up who the people are to the king. He just says, a people. And so I don't know why we see maybe it would be dangerous for Esther to state that she was a Jew. We talked a little bit about that before. But she's going to reveal it to him in time, of course. And so maybe it just wasn't the right time. And Mordecai had that wisdom to know it wasn't the right time for her to bring it up. But she still, again, as being queen and been queen a while, had not revealed this. And so then, verse 21, it says, so in those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And so we're not told why these two eunuchs were angry. We're just told that they were angry and that they wanted to lay hands on him and kill him. So then verse 22, so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And so Mordecai does the right thing. He heard them complaining and plotting against the king, and he then tells it to Esther, who then passes it along to the king. Now it's interesting. Esther doesn't say that she heard it. She said, or somebody else heard it. She said Mordecai heard it. That's going to be important later, because when the king is restless and he is wanting things to be read, he finds out that here Mordecai had done this, and he's going to praise him. He's going to put him up on a pedestal in a sense later on. And so that's going to be important. So by her stating Mordecai was the one that heard this plot, it's going to be a big thing in the future. And so verse 23, it says, and when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. And so he finds out, he informs, and the men were hanged for their plot. And it's interesting their names are brought up. It didn't just say two men. He specifically states who these two people were. And so it's just interesting. But this is going to set us up for later. It's going to be important detail when we get to later down the road. All right, any questions on chapter 2?
It's interesting that Mordecai told Esther to tell the king for several reasons, in my mind at least.
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, think about that. Yeah.
So that's part of it. And the other part of, you know, a lot of people would say, well, I've got something I've got to tell the king. But he told Esther, and she revealed it. And that was her proper place to reveal it because she was his wife,
Mm-hmm.
queen. But he could have said, well, I've got something, and I need to tell the king. So he would have got honored for that. So it says a lot about his character.
Yeah. Yeah, he wanted to make sure she did it, not him, and get that honor, which he's going to end up getting that honor later on. But yeah, I mean, he could have not said anything either because of what happened and just let him die, and then, but he didn't.
And that's why I'm torn. I know you can talk about, you know, the corruption in his concubines and all that. You know, as far as, I don't know, you know, Ahasuerus or Xerxes, you know, what kind of man, you know, Mordecai viewed him as.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had respect for him in the way he dealt with him, and had respect, and taught Esther to respect him. Because that's what, I just wonder about that, you know what I'm saying?
Well, the thing is, I think it's important because he is king, and God throughout history has shown that we should respect those in the authority, and so he's doing that, even though he's in bondage in a foreign country. He's still showing that respect and teaching to Esther. Yeah, so even though he didn't like him, and that's a New Testament principle too. What does Paul say in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 1 and 2? Same thing. Pray for our leaders for peace. But pray for, and he was saying Nero. I mean, he didn't say that, but that's who it was. It was Nero. Nero was killing the Christians at that time. So, yeah, it's good. He's teaching, you know, obviously she has good characteristics. And where do you think she got those from? More than likely Mordecai, right? Because he's the one that raised her. And so she learned from him, and she respects him, and she's obviously respects the king too. All right, anything else in chapter 2? All right, let's jump over to chapter 3 now. All right, so now we're going to start learning about Haman. All right, so let's read verse 1 through 6. Somebody want to read that, please? Handouts. I do have a handout for this back here, sorry. I don't know if everybody saw it.
You said 1 through 6.
Yeah, 1 through 6. Go ahead.
After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him, and all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow to him or homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai.
All right, so verse 1, we learn about Haman. And so it's believed that there's been a few years after the events of chapter 2 that has brought us to chapter 3. And just like similar to chapter 1 to chapter 2, it's believed there was several years. It gave Xerxes time to, because it was believed in chapter 1 he was preparing to go to Greece and his conquest there, which ended up badly for him. And so when we get to chapter 2, then that's after he has come back. It's also believed that between chapter 2 and chapter 3 there is some time. How long that time is, we don't know. Some say it's just a couple years. But in that period of time, we have someone who has rose in prominence in the king's eyes, and that man is Haman. And so we're learning about Haman. And it says that he is the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And so Haman, it's interesting, his name. It means splendid or magnificent. Was that something that described Haman? No. But obviously, that is something that the king saw that in him. Maybe he thought he was magnificent. Obviously, he did, because it tells us that he promoted him and advanced him and set him a seat above all the princes who were with him. He put him basically at second in command of the kingdom. He has great authority. He has great power. He can do basically whatever he wants. In a sense, they say this is basically like the prime minister of a country, like England and stuff like that. The prime minister of England has a lot of power. And not as much here in America. We don't look at a prime minister that way, but in other countries. And so he was promoted to second in command. And so his name means splendid, magnificent. And it says he was a Agagite. Now, if you're reading from a Josephus, Josephus believes that he was an Amalekite. Where have we seen the Amalekites in Scripture? Yeah, they went up against Israel in the wilderness. But also, if you were in 1 Samuel 15, who was supposed to kill all the Amalekites? Saul. And when Saul, of course, went through and did what he was supposed to do, well, he didn't do what he was supposed to do. The king was left, right? That was all that was left. And Samuel killed that king. Well, Josephus believes that this man, Haman, was a descendant of that king, the Amalekites. Now, since he believes that, which of course Josephus wrote during the time of Christ, he wrote about these events previous and says that, but Saul or Samuel killed this would be the king of the Amalekites. So it's kind of hard to believe that that's the case. But later on in history, here's a quote from the ISBE. This is a encyclopedia, Bible encyclopedia. It says, in an inscription found in Sargon, I'm not going to say the other word, the father of Sennacherib says, 34 districts of Media I have conquered, and I added them to the domain of Assyria. I imposed on them an annual tribe of horses. The country of Agazai, or Agag, I ravaged, wasted, and burned. And so it was found that there was a kingdom or a territory of people that was close to Media. So Media, remember Media and Persia joined together to create Medo-Persia. Well, that's over here. So it would have been around that same area. And so, yeah, even though Josephus says that he thought that he was an Amalekite, which then some like to take that because of what we see happens with Mordecai. Mordecai being a Jew and Haman being a Amalekite, they want to say, well, then that's why he didn't bow down to him. But we're going to talk about that. I think there's more to that. But I think what is true here is that he was just a man from this kingdom that was close to Media, who rose to power and prominence, and King Ahasuerus liked him. And he set him above all the princes that were in his kingdom. And so verse 2, it says, and all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him, but Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. So it's interesting we see this, because what did we see about Haman in the last chapter? Or not Haman, Mordecai in the last chapter with the king. Yeah, he gave the king respect. Now the king has a man that is his second in command. He obviously has authority. He obviously has power and should be respected. Yet we see Mordecai not bowing down to him. So there has to be more to this. Why would he not bow down to him? Well, it's interesting the words that are used here. 2 words. It says bow and homage. The word homage means reverence, but it can also mean worship. Have we seen where that has happened in the past, where they were supposed to worship the king in a sense, and or an image of someone. But we are told Mordecai would not bow. Somebody read Exodus 20, verse 1 through 6. Remember, Mordecai is a Jew. Exodus 20, verse 1 through 6.
And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which hath brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments.
Okay, so as a Jew, was he supposed to bow down to anybody but God? No. That bowing down means worship there. In that, should not worship an idol, should not worship anyone else. So he's a Jew, and so in this situation, even though he was a very respectful man and he respected the king, he was not going to worship the king. He was not going to worship this man who was now put in second command. Now, was it the fact some commentators will say, well, then he just didn't want to bow down to him because he didn't respect him. Do we see men of God bowing down to someone else in a sense of respect in the Bible? Well, we do, not in worship, not an idea of worship. Somebody read Genesis 23 and verse 7.
Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth.
Okay, so he bowed himself down to the people of the land. What about David? Somebody read 1 Samuel 24 and verse 8.
David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stopped with his face to the earth and bowed down.
Okay, so he was bowing down to who?
Saul.
Saul, which was the king, right? It was a sign of respect for his position, who he was. Paid homage. So there's our word. Could be there. And so he paid homage. He bowed down to him in sign of respect. 1 Kings 1 and verse 16 is another verse, but Bathsheba did the same thing. So does God have a problem with a man bowing down to show respect to a king authority? No. So being who Mordecai was in the last chapter as being someone that was respectful, and then we get over to chapter 3 and we see him not, in a sense, showing respect, I believe that this was more of a worship. Because the word homage could be used in reverence or also in a sense of in worship. And so why did Mordecai not bow down to him? Well, he's asked that in verse 3. It says, Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, Why do you transgress the king's command? That would happen when they spoke to him daily. He would not listen to them. That they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. So Mordecai, in his explanation to them, says, Well, I'm a Jew. So to me, that means with the use of bowing and homage being used in this text, that he was not going to bow down in a sense of worshiping him. And I think that's what Haman wanted here. Haman wanted to be worshipped by the people. And Mordecai, being a Jew, knew God's command, Exodus chapter 20, and said, No, I am not going to worship you, just like what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Same thing, right? Very similar, Daniel 3, verse 10 through 12. And so, and when I read this, I'm like, why did he not do that? Well, there had to be a reason. I think with the use of the word bow and homage being together, that shows us that it was more than just showing respect. It was, he wanted him to be worshipped. He wanted to be worshipped by the people. And we see his pride and arrogance as we go through this chapter. And I think that has a part in that, for sure. So we see him, and we're going to talk more about it. We're out of time, but we'll talk more about that. But it's interesting that these people, the other servants that are at this gate come up to him and say, hey, why aren't you doing this? Because it almost seems like they're trying to find a way to say, we don't want to do this either. Why are you doing it? We want to ask you why.
But did he know that Haman was an enemy of the Jews?
No, not at that time. No, because I don't think Haman was an enemy of the Jews at that point until he found out what Mordecai was doing. It's because he was very, he had a lot of wrath because of it.
I think
So.
Xerxes saw a lot of himself in Haman.
Mm-hmm.
That's why and then when he started to see who Haman was, he probably found some reflection on his own life.
Yeah, I think you're right, for sure. Because, Xerxes reacted a lot of times hastily with things, and his wrath would get out of control. So.
He was mad at his wife, so he said, I'll find another one. He was mad at Haman, or Mordecai said, well, we'll kill you
Yep, very similar.
for your family.
For